Normal looking photos that have a disturbing backstory. These pieces of yarn in a first grade classroom are the trajectories of the bullets fired by the Sandy Hook shooter in 2012, who killed 20 children and 6 adults. The reason that the angles are pointing downward is quite disturbing when you think about it. Dutch teenager Gary Slock and his mother Petra posted this photo to Facebook moments before their plane was shot down by Russians, killing all 298 people aboard. At first glance, it looks like this woman is resting peacefully, until you notice that that's a car roof twisted around her like bed sheets. She jumped from the top of the Empire State Building and happened to land in this very graceful, peaceful way. This is the last photo ever taken of 18-year-old Jolie Callan, who after this photo was taken was shot twice in the head and pushed off of the cliff by her ex-boyfriend. While this may seem like a normal family photo, just below the wife is a rattlesnake about to strike her arm. She was bitten and survived, but the dog died. This photo shows a man and a woman on the 70s game show, The Dating Game. The man in this photo who won the date with the woman is Rodney Alcala, a famous serial killer. Cheryl Bradshaw, the woman, found him extremely creepy and after the camera stopped rolling, refused to go on a date with him, possibly saving her life.
I need y'all to look at this man's face and remember it. This is Gabriel Calixto, and he's been on the run for nearly 3 weeks for allegedly murdering his girlfriend. On July 11th at 11:30 p.m., a woman called police and said that her brother Gabriel may have injured his girlfriend. Springfield, Illinois police responded to the home and found 24-year-old Emma Schaefer deceased. She had been fatally stabbed several times. Gabriel had already fled. The following day, an arrest warrant was issued for Gabriel for 3 counts of first-degree murder and aggravated domestic battery. His bond amount is $3 million. It's believed that Gabriel has fled the Springfield, Illinois area. He allegedly has ties to Bethalto, Illinois, St. Louis, and Toluca, Mexico. This isn't Gabriel's first run-in with the law or act of violence against a woman. In 2018, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for kidnapping a Bethalto woman. That conviction was vacated in 2020 and he was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge. He also got credit for time served and was released. In 2021, he was also apparently facing a federal charge for illegal entry. Emma was a local activist and loved by so many people in her community. Her life was really just getting started. And now on top of everyone grieving her loss, her alleged killer is still on the run. The U.S. Marshals have officially joined the hunt for Gabriel. He is considered dangerous. If you see him, please do not approach, just immediately call police.
A Pennsylvania couple is accused of killing a man that was found on the side of the road. The body of 44-year-old Darrell Lee was found on the 14th of July. His cause of death was a single gunshot wound. It's believed that Justin Green, who is pictured here, was working with Darrell at some landscaping jobs on the day he went missing. Justin initially told police that he'd simply given Darrell a lift home. However, CCTV from the area painted a different picture. Police believed that Justin and his girlfriend Brooke Pullin could be involved in the victim's death. Now, Brooke has multicoloured hair, and a multicoloured hair was actually found on Darrell's body. The couple claimed that they went on a road trip on the evening in question. 2 shotgun shells were found in Justin's vehicle. When the pair were arrested, they were found in possession of Darrell's bank card. Justin then told police that he had shot Darrell while driving. He said he then covered up Darrell's body with clothing and tools that were in the car. He claims that he then went and picked his girlfriend up from home. He said that even when she was in the car, she had no idea that a body was in the passenger seat. The pair are currently being held in custody.
Okay, the verdict seems to be in order, and I will read it as follows. Question 1. At the time the crimes were committed, did the defendant have a mental disease or mental defect? Answer, no. There's no answer then for question 2. It is dated this date, July 27, 2023, signed by the foreperson. There were no dissenting jurors.
A mystery woman was killed over 40 years ago. Police now know her identity and are hunting her killer. A 23-year-old woman who was killed has now been identified, and her killer is still out there. 40 years after her remains were discovered in Nashville, the mystery woman has been identified as Michelle Inman. She was identified through genetic genealogy. Her skeletal remains were discovered by a driver who was having trouble with their car. They pulled over back in March 1985 and discovered her body. It was determined that she was killed around 2 to 5 months before her body was found. Investigators were actually able to find her brother through the new information, but he said that he hadn't been in contact with her for over 40 years. This is quite obvious because it's been over 40 years since she died. We still have no idea who is responsible for her death.
This little girl was killed by a Sunday school teacher. This is 8-year-old Sandra Cantu, and she was born on March 8th of 2001 and was from Tracy, California. She lived with her mother, her grandparents, 3 older siblings, and she was in the 2nd grade. Friday, March 27th of 2009, Sandra was playing at a friend's house after school until around 4 p.m. when she went back home. Later that evening, she left the house once more to go to a different friend's house, but she did not return home for dinner. At 7:53 p.m., she was reported missing to the police. Police had collected footage of a surveillance camera that was in front of her home, and it showed her crossing the street in front of her house. An early suspect on this case was a man who was seen kissing Sandra on the lips 2 years earlier at a public swimming pool. He was interviewed, but he was cleared of any involvement. On April 6, a suitcase was found during a routine draining of an irrigation pond with Sandra's body inside. Sandra's autopsy revealed she was beaten and SA'd with a foreign object before being killed. Police began to become very suspicious of 28-year-old Melissa Huckabee, who was a Sunday school teacher. Melissa's daughter was actually good friends with Sandra, and the day that Sandra went missing, Melissa texted Sandra's mother and said, "Tell police I had something stolen around 4 p.m. today. I don't know if that makes a difference or not." Next day at Sandra's vigil, Melissa was there and she approached police and FBI agents, and she told them that she found a note on the ground and it basically stated where Sandra's body was. Investigators take a look at Melissa's behavior, and that is when they become suspicious of her. Police look at the surveillance footage once again, and it shows Sandra walking towards Melissa's home, and then 8 minutes later it shows Melissa driving her SUV the opposite direction. FBI agents decide to search the church where Melissa taught Sunday school, and they head to the kitchen area, and that is when they find a rolling pin with blood on it, and it tests positive for Sandra's DNA. On April 10th of 2009, Melissa was arrested and charged with the murder of Sandra. Melissa pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and kidnapping of Sandra to avoid the death penalty. She is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
The Long Island serial killer has finally allegedly been caught, almost 13 years after he murdered 4 women on Long Island, New York. The Long Island serial killer, or LISK case, is a case that's haunted people for years, and it really was launched in 2010 when 4 women's bodies were discovered in Long Island, New York. 4 women who would be known as the Gilgo 4. These 4 women, Melissa, Maureen, Megan, and Amber, were all sex workers in the New York City area, and they had all at the time of their disappearances seemingly vanished from the face of the earth. All 4 of their bodies, though, were eventually found on Gilgo Beach in Long Island, New York. Now, these disappearances took place over a number of years. The earliest was in 2007 and the last was in 2010. But in total, there have actually been 7 bodies found in that area that people think may be linked to the same serial killer, including the unidentified remains of a toddler who was 16 to 24 months in age. And the sad thing about this is that that toddler was actually the daughter of another victim. This was confirmed through DNA and the remains that were found, which means that most likely the killer murdered both of them at the same time. So for years, the LISK case was a huge case and nobody had any concrete leads. There was no DNA evidence. There were no surveillance videos. There was really nothing. That is, until just recently, today, when this guy was arrested. Rex McElroy, a 59-year-old architect who worked in Manhattan but lived very close to Gilgo Beach. Rex, interestingly enough, is a family man. He's married, he has 2 kids, and he works in a powerful position at the architecture firm that he's employed with. Authorities had been searching for a link between McElroy and the Gilgo 4 for a long time, but finally, just recently, they got a break when they recovered this pizza box from a garbage can. And when they tested some of the DNA that was found on this pizza box pictured here, it was almost a perfect match to the DNA found on the hair of victim Megan Waterman. At this point, though, there are a lot of things that allegedly link Rex to this case. For example, cell phone bills show that he met with 3 of the victims before they went missing. Records from a burner cell phone that he was using also show that Rex placed menacing phone calls to the relative of Melissa Bartholomew, who was a victim of his. He also had a fake profile on Tinder, and he extensively contacted massage parlors and different escort services trying to arrange these sexual liaisons. Now, what's interesting and that I don't see a lot of people talking about on here is that his wife's DNA has also been connected to the murders. Apparently, authorities collected a water bottle from outside of the Huerman home, and his wife's DNA was a match to a piece of female hair that they found on tape that was used to bind two of the victims, and it was also a match to DNA that was found on a belt that was used to tie up a victim's feet. One of his phones also was linked to tons of disturbing searches. I'm talking about CP, I'm talking about assault material, watching videos of women who were tied up with bruised faces, all this horrific stuff. And the cell phone also conducted tons of searches about the Long Island serial killer, why they hadn't caught him yet, and all other sorts of weird things that tie into the case. So what do you think? Is this Lisk? Let me know in the comments below and I'll keep you updated as soon as we find out more.
Here is part 2 to the case of Ken Rex McElroy. Even though Ken was found guilty of the attempted murder of Bo, he appealed these charges and was released on bond. He then continued on his rampage, threatening Bo around every corner. He would just camp in front of his house and threaten him. And that's when the town finally decided that they had enough. On July 10th of 1981, there was a community meeting and they were trying to decide what they would do about Ken Rex McElroy. They even spoke with the deputy, who said that there was nothing they could do and that they should just continue to basically ignore Ken. After speaking his piece, the deputy got into his car and then drove out of town. That's when Ken, along with his wife, drove up to the tavern that was right next to the community center where the entire town was meeting. While Ken was in the tavern, the entire community that was just having the meeting next door walked into the tavern and just surrounded Ken. That's when Ken walked back out to his truck. Ken got into his truck and started it. There were anywhere from 30 to 50 people surrounding his truck because they had all followed him out. And that's when several shots were heard. As soon as these shots were heard, everyone realized that Ken had in fact been shot, but nobody called an ambulance. In fact, it seemed like nobody was willing to move. All except his wife. Ken would not survive this attack, and when the 30 to 50 witnesses were questioned, nobody saw a thing. There have been some names that have been thrown out about who actually fired the shot that killed Ken, but the prosecution never pressed any charges against anybody. Several years later, Ken's wife did file a wrongful death lawsuit, but she moved on with her life as well, and to this day, Ken's case has never been solved. So here's my question. Since Ken was not a great guy, and by not a great guy, I mean he was a terrible human, do you think that this was justified? Because personally, I feel like it was. Ken was just not a good person. He didn't offer anything good to society, and I completely understand why the town would finally try to take justice into their own hands since they had been let down by the courts so many times. But I would love to know your thoughts down in the comments, so leave them down there and follow for more true crime.
On November 23, 2021, 3 days after Bobby Ann went missing, 24-year-old Cody Ackland walked into the Charles Cross police station and told them he was there to confess to the murder of Bobby Ann McLeod. Cody wasn't someone who was on the police's radar and didn't really fit the profile of a killer. He had never been in trouble with the law and lived a pretty productive life. He worked as a car valet and was also part of a 4-piece indie band called Rakuta, who released their first album in 2020 and was very popular in the Plymouth area. Ackland was actually their lead guitarist and main songwriter at the time. The confession obviously came as a shock to the police, but they immediately took him back to the interrogation room wanting to know what he had to say. After sitting down with police, Ackland asked them to provide him with a map of Plymouth and then pointed out to an area in Bovisand. Police immediately dispatched units to the area, and after less than 2 hours of searching, they found the body of Bobby Ann McLeod. Police then arrested Cody Ackland and charged him with the murder of Bobby Ann McLeod, and they quickly realized that he was quite open to speaking to them. Ackland confessed to abducting and murdering Bobby Ann on the night of November 20th, 2021. He told police that he didn't know Bobby, and that it was simply a crime of opportunity. He said that on that fateful night, he was feeling quite low and needed to get out of the house a bit. He said that he passed the bus stop where Bobby was waiting, and she immediately caught his eye as she reminded him of a girl he used to date. He said that he suddenly had the urge to harm her, so he stopped his car not too far from the bus stop and walked toward Bobby. He said that he silently crept up behind her and then struck her over the head with a claw hammer a number of times until she fell to the ground. He said that as he was walking back to his car, he noticed that Bobby was still alive and that she was trying to lift herself up. Ackland then got into his car and drove back to the bus stop before dragging Bobby to the footpath just off the road. Here he strangled her until he thought she was dead, and then put her in the back of his car where he intended to dump her body. He then drove with her to a remote part of Dartmoor about 19 miles away. When he got to Dartmoor and wanted to take Bobby out of the car, he realized that Bobby Ann was miraculously still alive and that she was able to sit up. He then took her out of the car and put her arm around his neck, where he proceeded to walk with her into the wooded area. Ackland said that at some point during their walk, Bobby told him that she was scared, to which he replied that he was too, and that this was the first time he's ever done this before. He then proceeded to repeatedly hit her with a hammer until she fell to the ground, and then he stomped on her neck until she stopped breathing. He then burned her handbag and other belongings which she had on her, before putting her back in the car and driving with her to Bovesand, about 25 miles away. Ackland then stripped her from her clothes and jewelry before dumping her body in an overgrowth area in Bovesand, down a steep bank by the side of a wooded lane.
Bobby did not stand a chance on being attacked by a man using a claw hammer who was intent on delivering a callous and sustained assault for which he has shown no remorse.
Picture this. It's the summer of 1975 and 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington has left her Pennsylvania home to walk to Bible camp. Somewhere along her 10-minute route, she vanishes. 2 months later, her skeletal remains were found in a state park 7 miles from her home. Despite police efforts, the case goes cold, and it stays that way for nearly 50 years, until now. This is 83-year-old David Zandstra. He was just charged with Gretchen's murder. But who is he? Did he even know her? The answer is yes. David Zandstra was a pastor who worked at the Bible camp the girl was headed to that day. Let's start from the beginning. On August 5th, 1975, Gretchen Harrington left her Marple Township home to go to Bible camp just a short walk away. According to the Delaware County DA, the camp was held at 2 locations that day, a church where her father was a pastor and a church where Zandstra was a pastor. She disappeared along the walk to her father's church. According to Medium, cops responded quickly due to her age. Within hours, Marple Township police had gathered hundreds of volunteers to search the area. They also set up a 24-hour tip hotline. From the start, Gretchen's parents, the Reverend Harold Harrington and Ina Harrington, maintained that their daughter wouldn't have gotten into a vehicle with a stranger. On October 14th, 1975, a jogger spotted skeletal remains at Ridley Creek State Park. They belonged to Gretchen. Her death was ruled a homicide. According to court documents, a medical examiner said she suffered 2 or more blunt impacts to the skull. Because the body was found in a state park, Pennsylvania State Police joined the investigation. They believe she was killed in the same spot she was found. Though officials couldn't determine whether Gretchen had been sexually assaulted, investigators believed it was a possibility. The killer had removed her clothing and her underwear had been placed on a tree branch. Per the Delaware County DA, law enforcement officials spent the days following interviewing locals and registered sex offenders in the area. There was reportedly a person of interest, but police had no real evidence. One witness did report seeing Gretchen talking to an unidentified man in either a 2-tone Cadillac or a green station wagon. We now know that Zandstra was interviewed by police the month that Gretchen's body was found, and get this, according to a newly released criminal complaint, investigators were suspicious of him from the jump, reportedly noticing inaccuracies in his statements. Plus, he somehow knew what Gretchen was wearing that day despite the fact that she never arrived at camp. Still, the case went cold. Now flash forward to this year. On January 2nd, 2023, investigators interviewed an individual who was reportedly best friends with Zandstra's daughter, per the Delaware County DA. The person said they awoke to Zandstra groping them during a sleepover. They claim they told his daughter, who said that the then pastor did that sometimes. The informant also showed police a diary entry the individual wrote in 1975, the year Gretchen was killed. According to the criminal complaint, she wrote, "Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. It's a secret, so I can't tell anyone, but I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z." Investigators then confronted Zandstra with the evidence. According to the Delaware County DA, he admitted to everything. He told officials that, as noted in witness reports from that day, he had been driving a green station wagon when he saw Gretchen walking to camp. He offered her a ride but drove to a wooded area nearby instead of the church. The former pastor said he then told Gretchen to remove her clothes, but she refused. After that, Zandstra said he struck her in the head with a fist. Thinking she was dead, he tried to cover up her body and left. On July 17, 2023, Zandstra was arrested in Cobb County, Georgia, and charged with murder in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degree, criminal homicide, possession of an instrument of crime, and the kidnapping of a minor. Investigators are now in the process of testing Zandra's DNA against evidence found in other cold cases and not just in Pennsylvania. DNA comparisons will also be made in Georgia and Texas, 2 states in which Zandstra previously lived.
It's 1984 in a small town in Brazil called Garahum. Jorge Negromonte and his wife Isabel want nothing more but to have a child and start a family, but they can't. A few years pass by, and after countless attempts at having a child and not succeeding, Jorge decides to take matters into his own hands. He then meets a young girl, Bruna Oliveira, who he describes as a captivatingly beautiful brunette. However, she's just a teenager. Jorge's 34 and she is 16. It's almost more conceivable that she would be the daughter that he never had, but regardless, she becomes Jorge's mistress. Bruna eventually moves in with the couple, starts living in their home, and Isabel seemingly doesn't mind. And as Bruna's been living with them for some time, she begins to realize that Jorge is a completely different guy when he's not taking his medication. She begins telling him about her interest in Satanism, and eventually reveals to him that she herself is a witch. Together they start learning about black magic, Wicca, and the occult, and together form their own secret sect or branch of Satanism. Meanwhile, Jorge still has a deep desire to have children and begins growing envious of his neighbors, whom he thinks in his mind do not deserve kids because they'll grow up to be nothing more than low-life criminals who serve no purpose other than polluting the world. This deep-rooted jealousy, combined with their interest in black magic, causes Jorge, Isabel, and Bruna to conjure up a plan for revenge. They find it imperative, almost necessary, that they kill the women of the world that God would deem as worthless trash. The only problem, however, is that this sin violates the 7th commandment, thou shalt not kill. They consider this briefly, but eventually come to the conclusion the only way God will forgive me for this is if I purify myself. And how do they purify themselves? Eating the bodies. Maybe not the solution that I would have went with, but in 2011, Bruna and Isabel go out into town to look for female victims. While on their hunt, they stumble across a 17-year-old teenage mom named Jessica. She's just had a newborn baby, but she's broke, desperate, and hungry. Isabel and Bruna start having a conversation with her, and they seem quite trustworthy. The three then head toward the Negromonte home, where the teen mom starts doing odd jobs around the house for about 3 months until January 2012. It's just like any other day. Jessica arrives at the trio's home to do some chores around the house, and she's holding her baby in her arms, having a conversation with Bruna, and all of a sudden Jorge comes up from behind her. He takes a giant machete and stabs Jessica in the neck. She then collapses, holding her child in her arms, and dies before she hits the ground. The love triangle then proceeds to dismember Jessica's body while her child is watching and consume bits and pieces of her flesh. A month later, 21-year-old Gazelle de Silva is lured to the home and experiences a similar fate. Bruna and Isabel invite her over to talk about their devotion to God, but things don't exactly work out that way. The third and final killing occurs 30 days later when the girls lure Alexandra de Silva to the household, claiming they need a babysitter to watch over their child. In reality, this is the child of Jessica, the teen mom, but regardless, 20-year-old Alexandra is interested in the position, so she travels to the family home, where her life is taken in a very similar fashion. They proceed to take all of her possessions, including her credit cards, and that's when Bruna makes a crucial mistake. She uses the credit card at a nearby store, yes, the credit card of a missing woman. Police track her down, find her, and take her into questioning. When she's arrested, not only does she admit to killing the babysitter they tried to hire, Alexandra, but also Gazelle, the woman they found off the street, and the first victim, Jessica. She then goes on to explain that it's very unlikely the officers will be able to find these bodies because, well, they had been cooking them into meat pies and selling them around the neighborhood for the community to enjoy. Police immediately call in a raid to the home of Jorge Negromonte and find him, a bag of bones, and a 50-page manifesto entitled Revelations of a Schizophrenic. And when the story gets out, not only are people in the local community feeling disgusted about the horrors that went on in the Negromonte home, but also they're feeling physically ill because those meat pies were extremely popular and sold all over town. Jorge is then dubbed the real-life Sweeney Todd. 2 years later, in 2014, the trial begins, and while people find the heinous details of the case to be quite disturbing, they are left feeling even more uncomfortable by the behavior of the defendants. Jorge and Bruna are often seen smiling in court, growing more and more affectionate with one another with each gruesome detail. They seem happy, almost euphoric, when the court starts talking about the trio turning people into pies, but this attitude quickly changes when the verdict is released. Jorge Negromante is convicted on 2 counts of murder, concealment, and vilification of a corpse and is given 71 years in prison. Isabel is given a slightly less severe sentence